Good morning.
Good morning.
It's always great to be with you guys. It's a very special privilege. So in this week of July 4th, so many of us are thinking about freedom. And we heard a hymn about it and a reading. The word is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. And it's at the core of Torah's central story. The Israelites gaining their freedom from bondage in Egypt, a story which resonates with later freedom fighters like Martin Luther King, and it becomes the basis of what's called liberation theology. In politics, folks on all sides of the political spectrum preach freedom. Regardless of our religious or political stripes, we all seem to love freedom. But what is it? Turns out there are many faces of freedom, and some of which conflict with others. So on this July 4th weekend, let's explore some of those faces of freedom. And you'll find in your leaflet, by the way, a little pink sheet with some dates, and I'll be referring to the dates, and so it might get a little confusing, and that'll help you. It's a little cheat sheet on what those dates are. So I want to hearken back to soon after Governor Gianforte and I were first elected, and he urged me to read a favorite book of his that contrasts the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The book argued that the American Revolution was grounded in our gaining freedom from a foreign despotic ruler, while the French Revolution was different. It sought liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, and brotherhood. The French Revolution understood freedom as intertwined with restructuring the inequalities in the socio-economic system. But the American Revolution, in contrast, did not include an emphasis on equality. After all, we were a nation at that time where owning humans was lawful, where women couldn't vote or own property, and where natives were slaughtered or forced onto reservations. Though the Declaration of Independence said that, quote, all men are created equal in the eyes of God, that was understood really to mean that the king was no better than colonialists. It wasn't a statement about equality. In fact, there's nary a word about equality in our Constitution. It even expressly prohibited Congress from banning the import of slaves, at least until 1808. And our Bill of Rights mostly promises freedom from governmental interference and speech, bearing arms, unreasonable seizures, and the like, but has little to say about equality. So conservatives, like our governor, hearken back to the American Revolution of 1776, and they argue that freedom from government is the core American freedom, the American ideal. They say that, unlike France, our government has no role to play in guaranteeing equality. The book he recommended to me explained it like this, quoting, "Neither equality nor fraternity can be achieved through force by the state. Perfect equality is elusive, and even if it could be achieved, would be inconsistent with liberty. Whereas Americans struggled for tangible goals, the French took on the Sisyphean task of striving for abstractions," end quote. So nearly a century later, in 1865, our lack of commitment to equality caught up with us, leading to the Civil War, and in 1868, constitutional amendments which promised some equality in law. But that progress has since seen many retrenchments, from Jim Crow laws to current attacks on attempts to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion. Segregation was considered separate but equal in the United States until 1954 in the Brown versus Board of Education decision. The 19th Amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote was introduced in 1878, but didn't pass until 1920. And the ERA, first introduced in 1923, still has not passed. A century later, I heard a groan. A century later, after it was first introduced. In many ways, we are still struggling for the equality in law that the Civil War and the 13th and 14th Amendments and later the 1960s Civil Rights Movement promised us. So equality is a type of freedom. But rather than freedom from government action, it is freedom to equally partake in society's promises, regardless of race, gender, or social status. And these two classical types of freedom, which each claim historical legitimacy to either 1776 or 1865, and are often in tension with one another. After all, if we're to be free from government interference in our lives, how can the government interfere by requiring us to grant others freedom to partake in society's promises? And as I mentioned, I'm going to be referring to these types of freedom by date, so you've got your cheat sheet. In the last decade, the tension between these two classical faces of freedom has pushed both into new directions, new territories, each with a new understanding of freedom. Many of those who understood freedom to be about equality, to partake in society's promises, realized that despite the advances made in 1865 and in the 1960s Civil Rights Movement, equality has not yet become a reality because racism is stubbornly and structurally embedded in American society and law. The New York Times 1619 Project, together with the Black Lives Matter movement and others, asserted that freedom must be understood not by hearkening back to 1776 or 1865, but to 1619, the year when slaves first arrived in America. They see slavery as what defined America, positing that 1865 freedom has not adequately undone its impacts. For them, real freedom, which I'll call 1619 freedom, requires thoroughly shaking off the chains of slavery that still bind Black Americans, utilizing tools like strong affirmative action, diversity and equity programs, reparations, and at the personal level, affirmatively confronting racism in every encounter, which is the subject of several recent books that some of you may be familiar with. So the recent push for 1619 freedom has caused significant entrenchment, especially by 1776 freedom folks, which in the 2010s began to give way to yet another understanding of freedom, one grounded in populism. So populism begins with the 1776 idea of freedom from the despotic actions of a foreign king. But the enemy infringing on freedom is no longer a foreign king. Instead, the enemies from whom they seek freedom are internal rulers, seen as despotic elites, combined with other groups, like namely immigrants and those who are other in their view of things. I'll call this freedom 2010's freedom, since populism has taken off in this period, winning elections in Hungary, the United States, Italy, Israel, Netherlands, and this weekend it looks like France, among other countries. Elected officials who share this view that freedom is about freedom from these amorphous elites, immigrants, and the other, call themselves freedom caucuses in Congress and in state legislatures. So to summarize, the 1619 freedom folks moved beyond the 1865 freedom folks because the 1619 folks believed that 1865 folks didn't go far enough in bringing about freedom to equally partake in society's promises. In much the same way, the 2010s freedom folks have moved past the 1776 freedom folks, often labeling them as rhinos for not going far enough to understand that the enemy denying their freedom is not just the tyrannical government, but also the tyrannical elites and the others. The irony, of course, is that while the 1776 freedom folks rebelled against a foreign tyrannical king, the 2010s freedom fighters desire a king who will restore the freedoms they say being taken by the elites. Their king, however, must be domestic, since they maintain pretty much disdain for most things foreign. Also ironic is that these freedom caucuses devalue norms usually associated with freedom, such as freedom of speech and press, elections, and the democratic process. So these competing ideas about freedom are driving today's political divide. And to illustrate, I want to use an odd example. It's not the one that would come to most of your minds, I'm sure, initially. So a bill came up in the legislature this last session which prohibited cities and counties from single-family zoning, requiring that cities allow at least for triplexes in all residential areas. The bill passed in the House 95-5, and I was one of the 5 naysayers. You'll see why. So for my friends in the 1776 camp, if you own property, you ought to have freedom from governmental interference, which means the ability to do with it what you want. If you want to build an apartment building or a department store or a gas station next to your neighbor's single-family home, that's your right, your property, your freedom from governmental interference. My friends in the 1865 camp also supported the bill. Many felt that single-family homes contradict their idea about equality, and that people of lesser means ought to have the freedom to live in any housing and in all neighborhoods, unconstrained by their social status or wealth. The 1619 group felt similarly, but even more strongly, aware of how zoning laws have sometimes been deliberately used to exclude minorities from certain neighborhoods. And the 2010s group were also on board, as they see those living in neighborhoods with single-family homes as some of the elites who they despise. And although these 4 types of freedom often conflict, in this odd case, the interests converged. And the odd example illustrates the way we understand freedom and how it has led to our divided society. For those who define freedom in 1776 or 2010's terms, freedom is to keep what is mine without interference from the government or other groups. It has both economic and cultural components. Economically, it translates to freedom from taxes and governmental regulations, and at the cultural level, it translates to imposing their idea of traditional American culture. Indeed, leaders of the 2010s populist freedom movement, such as the Claremont Institute, the Manhattan Institute, the Heritage Foundation, Steve Bannon, and many others, have been plain that for them, freedom means returning America to white Christian patriarchy. Steve Bannon was quoted in the New York Times this week as saying that populist freedom would even welcome American Jews, conditionally, upon a hard weld between them and Christian nationalism. Can anybody say Spanish Inquisition? In that same interview, he dismisses, quote, country club Republicans who are not culture warriors for Christian nationalism. 1776 and 2010's freedom mostly result in broad economic freedom for insiders, but limited freedom for outsiders to make decisions outside the insider's image of cultural norms. The 1865 and 1619 ideas of freedom are usually just the opposite, advocating for broad freedom to express individuality outside of traditional cultural norms, but advocating for less freedom in economics, where they believe that the government should create greater equality in economic and social status. For these folks, at the cultural level, family systems can look at any way you want. You can believe in God or not. You can be whatever gender that expresses who you are. 1619 freedom aligns with 1865 freedom, but adds an additional element. It's not enough to oppose inequalities, but we must affirmatively create broad remedies for systemic discrimination, and each person must confront racism at every turn. So on this zoning bill, I found myself alone. First, I don't believe it will create more affordable housing, of which I'm a strong proponent, and if I thought it would, then I would probably have supported it. But rather, the new law will impact yet another kind of freedom, the community's freedom to maintain open spaces, walkability, knowing your neighbors, parking and congestion, qualities that give residents a highly valued sense of community. Significant alterations affect not just the individuals, but the community. It's similar to when a wetland is faced with unwelcome development pressure, such as increased runoff, so that the wetland no longer provides water retention or flood protection, water quality, or wildlife habitat. And just as substantial changes can alter the physical nature of a community, so too can changes alters the character which the community prizes. The bill may address various individual interests of these four freedom groups, but as far as I was concerned, its attitude was the integrity of communities be damned. So individual freedoms, as opposed to group freedoms like that of a community, are not emphasized in Torah. Freedom there begins with the people leaving slavery under a despotic Pharaoh, but it doesn't end there. Just 50 days later, the people arrive at Mount Sinai, where they receive the Torah and exercise their freedom by choosing to live according to its norms. Many rabbis teach that from this experience, when considered as a whole, it was about freedom of a people from living under a false god, Pharaoh, and his demands, to freedom to living under the Israelite God, who is infinite and nameless, the one who Moses encountered at the bush, and when asked his name said, Eheyeh asher eheyeh, I will be what I will be. The story combines elements of several kinds of freedom, with an overall focus on the health of a community. It overthrows despotic Pharaoh, like 1776 freedom, creates laws that promote equality, like 1865 freedom, and it provides some hints of 1619 freedom by providing for reparations for those who'd been enslaved in Egypt. However, it repeatedly warns against the populism of 2010's freedom in stories such as the overthrow of the populist Korach, which is actually the Jewish liturgy for this weekend, the requirement that a king cannot be above the law or accumulate wealth, as the Torah says, and in its condemnation of false prophets. Among its strongest anti-populist message is to never oppress the other, but to welcome and even love the stranger. Although the Torah's teachings on freedom are useful, the analogy runs into trouble in the context of America. The Torah was given to a particular people, a particular community with shared experiences, with cultural norms that spoke to those shared experiences. In America, we don't always have shared experiences to which one set of cultural norms can apply. But neither are we a nation of totally unconnected small groups. Along the way, we've created institutions that provide cultural norms, and living with those institutions has reinforced those cultural norms. Our institutions, tenuous and sometimes flawed and in need of updating as they may be, are much of what binds us as a nation and protects many of our freedoms. But the newer freedom notions of 1619 and 2010s tend to believe that our institutions are favoring one type of freedom over the other, leading to attacks on those institutions. For example, public schools and universities have historically been great equalizers. But 1619 freedom folks say they don't go far enough because, for example, schools in African American communities are often underfunded, while 2010s say that they've gone too far by being focused on what they call a woke agenda, which they see as upsetting their cultural norms. The results are, for example, the outlawing of diversity programs in some states, don't say gay laws, laws which prohibit the teaching of history that might make someone uncomfortable, and the overall destabilization of our schools and universities. Other institutions which are seen in 2010's freedom, by 2010's freedom folks as insufficiently deferential to their freedom to maintain their cultural norms are also under attack. Those include parts of the news media, courts, doctors, unions which advocate for economic equality, libraries, and even the electoral process itself. And institutions under attack by 1619 advocates include, for example, churches that promote cultural norms upholding traditional marriage and gender roles, or certain views of the role of race, which they find antithetical to their notion of freedom of equality. These folks also challenge institutions that uphold the status quo on economic inequality, such as neighborhoods. The distrust has led to Dan Rather giving way to Tucker Carlson and Rachel Maddow. Decades of precedent on bodily privacy, voting rights, affirmative action, and limited presidential power have been wiped away in just a few years by transformed courts. Librarians are threatened with jail for displaying books which contain LGBTQ characters, Doctors are threatened with jail for providing health care, and Liz Cheney is even threatened with jail for supporting democracy. With our institutions that protect our community freedoms teetering, we're left with all sides advocating for individual freedoms of insiders or outsiders, respectively, and we're back to neighborhoods. Zoning is how neighbors come together to affect the character of their neighborhood. There are limits, of course. A neighborhood could not exclude, say, UUs, though nobody would ever want to do that. But when the purpose is not to exclude, but to enhance character of the community, that's about our collective freedom. When we don't value community and collective freedom, we're left with competing freedoms of different individuals. So this morning I've wandered a lot, I know. And where does this leave us on Independence Day morning? Perhaps the great political challenge of our time. As the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote, quote, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." Actually, the Tutu quote that Peg so beautifully read more or less says the same thing. Liberal democracy gives people greater liberty than ever before, breaking down repression and control everywhere, in politics, religion, and society. It gives us all, admittedly in unequal measures, wealth, technology, and autonomy. But for many, these things cannot fill the hole in the heart that God, faith, and well-worn norms once occupied. To fill it with politics is dangerous, but that seems to be the shape of things to come. So if this leaves us in a precarious place, there are perhaps other types of freedom that can help, especially deeply personal and spiritual freedoms. I'm thinking about the wisdom of Viktor Frankl, who survived the death camps in the 1940s. In his epic work, Man in Search of Meaning, or actually Man's Search for Meaning, inspired by his understanding of freedom derived from the death camp experience, he reminds us of where we can find freedom in really tough times. First, he says, is freedom of choice. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and ultimately our freedom. Second is the freedom to love. Frankl writes movingly about the importance of love in finding meaning in life. We all have the freedom to love. Third is the freedom associated with responsibility. Logotherapy, Frankl's therapeutic approach, is based on the premise that we are fundamentally free to take responsibility for our lives. Fourth is the freedom to change. Frankl emphasizes that one of the core aspects of human existence is the ability to change. No matter our circumstances, we have the freedom to change ourselves and our attitudes towards our situations. Fifth, finally, is freedom to maintain our commitment to humanity. Frankl's experiences in the death camps illustrate that even in the most inhumane conditions, we have the freedom to retain our sense of humanity and make choices that reflect our innermost values and beings. So, friends, these are some of the faces of freedom. May we think of freedom not as the right to do as we please, but as the opportunity to do what is right. Each July 4th, we have the freedom to choose which of these faces of freedom we'll embrace in the coming year.